rancher shelters, an abandoned Apache child. Next morning, a giant widow came. The sun had just begun to rise over the hills, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. The ranch was quiet, except for the occasional lowing of cattle and the distant call of a hawk circling above. The land stretched for miles, rolling gently into the horizon, with patches of thick trees and narrow streams cutting through the open fields. Dust rose lazily from the dirt paths as the morning wind moved through the grass, carrying the scent of earth and the faint tang of smoke from the distant hills. John, the rancher, was already awake. He had been tending this land for most of his life, long before he could even remember. His hands were rough from years of handling ropes, feeding cattle, and chopping wood. His face, tanned and weathered, told the story of someone who had spent more time under the sun than under a roof. Despite his hardened exterior, John had a gentle heart, especially for those in need. That quality had kept him alive in many unexpected ways over the years, for kindness often drew unexpected allies, even in the harshest of lands. This morning, John was walking along the creek that ran behind his ranch. He had noticed the water levels were lower than usual, and he wanted to make sure none of his livestock had wandered too close to the edge. The creek was narrow but fast, and it cut through the fields like a silver ribbon. Birds darted over the water, and a family of deer watched cautiously from the tree line. John had grown used to the silence of the early morning, but today, something was different. At first, it was just a faint sound, a soft whimper that seemed almost like the wind playing tricks on his ears. John paused and looked around, his sharp eyes scanning the grass and trees. There was no one in sight, only the familiar shapes of the landscape he had known all his life. But the sound came again, clearer this time. It was definitely a cry, small and fragile, the kind of cry that could only belong to a child or a small animal. John's heart tightened. He had seen animals get trapped before, and sometimes they would not survive without help. He stepped carefully over rocks and fallen branches, following the sound. It led him to a small clearing near the edge of the creek. There, huddled against a tree, was the most startling sight he had ever seen. A little child, not older than 6, sat on the ground with knees drawn up and arms wrapped around them. The child's clothes were torn, dusty, and wet from the morning dew. Their small face was streaked with dirt, and tears glimmered in the faint light of dawn. The child looked up at John with wide, frightened eyes. Their gaze was cautious, almost as if they had never seen another human before, or if they had, it had been only in fear. The child's lips trembled, but no words came out. John crouched down slowly, making sure not to appear threatening. His voice, when he spoke, was soft and calm. "Hey there, little one. Don't be afraid. I won't hurt you." The child blinked, unsure what to do. Their bodies shook slightly, but the fear in their eyes seemed to soften just a little. John could see they were starving, their clothes torn not only from neglect but also from wandering through thick brush. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small piece of bread he had packed for himself. Slowly he extended it toward the child. The child hesitated, their tiny hands clutching at their chest as if protecting themselves from a threat. Hunger was stronger than fear, though, and eventually they reached out and took the bread. John smiled gently. "Good! That's a brave little hand." After a few moments, John noticed something else. The child was not alone. Near the edge of the clearing, there were signs of movement, footprints that were too small to be his own but too large to belong to the child. They were scattered and uneven, like whoever had been there had walked in a hurry or stumbled. John's mind raced. Why was this child here, alone, in the middle of nowhere? Who had left them? And why? Despite the questions swirling in his mind, John knew what he had to do. The child needed shelter and safety, even if only for a night. The ranch cabin was a short walk from the clearing, nestled under a stand of tall pines. The wooden structure was simple but sturdy, with a stone chimney and a small porch that creaked under John's boots. He gestured toward it. "Come on, little one. Let's get you inside where it's warm." The child looked at the cabin, then back at John, hesitation still lingering in their eyes. Finally, after a quiet moment, they nodded slightly and took John's hand. Their touch was delicate, almost fearful, but it was enough. Together they walked back toward the cabin, the morning sun climbing higher and casting long shadows across the land. Inside the cabin, John set the child down near the fire. He stoked the embers, coaxing them back to life, and the warmth began to chase away the chill of the early morning. He brought over a blanket and wrapped it gently around the child's shoulders. The child clutched it tightly, as if it were the only thing keeping them safe. John moved quietly around the cabin, preparing a small breakfast. He had some dried meat, bread, and fresh water, and he laid it all out carefully on the table. The child watched him, still wary but curious. They didn't speak a word, and John didn't push. He knew that trust could not be demanded, it had to be earned. As the child ate, John examined them more closely. Their hair was dark and tangled, and their eyes held a depth that seemed older than their years. Something about them was both fragile and resilient, as if they had already endured more than any child should. John felt a pang of sorrow mixed with determination. He would protect this child no matter what it took. The morning passed slowly. The child explored the cabin cautiously, touching objects with a mix of curiosity and fear. John watched them, offering quiet encouragement when they seemed uncertain. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying distant sounds of birds and the faint calls of cattle. The ranch felt alive in its usual way, but now it also held a new tension, a mystery that neither John nor the child could yet understand. By mid-morning, the child had begun to relax slightly. They sat by the window, watching the world outside, and for the first time, John saw a faint smile on their face. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make John's heart lift. He realized that, despite everything, this little soul had hope, and maybe, just maybe, that hope could survive here. John also noticed other signs around the cabin, strange tracks near the creek, a few broken branches, and the feeling of being watched. He couldn't shake the thought that someone, or something, had been here before him, but he pushed it aside for now. The child's safety was his priority, and the mystery could wait. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, John and the child settled into a rhythm. He spoke softly about life on the ranch, about the animals, the seasons, and the quiet beauty of the land. The child listened intently, nodding occasionally, though words were still few. There was a silent understanding forming between them, a bond that did not need speech to exist. And so, the morning continued. The ranch, with its wide-open fields and hidden secrets, seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere beyond the hills, the world went on, unaware of the small cabin and the fragile life it now sheltered. John kept one eye on the horizon and one on the child, knowing that the day ahead would bring challenges, questions, and perhaps even danger. But for now, there was warmth, there was safety, and there was the quiet, unspoken promise that this abandoned child would not face the world alone. As the first part of the day drew to a close, John felt a strange mixture of hope and unease. He did not yet know who had left this child in the wilderness or why. He did not know what dangers lurked nearby. But he knew one thing with certainty. He would protect this child until he could understand the full story, and he would face whatever came next with courage. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a faint sound that made John pause. It was almost like a whisper, distant yet clear, as if the land itself were warning him. The child clutched the blanket closer, and John placed a reassuring hand on their shoulder. Together they faced the quiet mystery of the morning, unaware that the events of the next day would change everything they thought they knew about the world and about each other. The sun climbed higher, spilling warm light over the ranch, but the small cabin remained cozy and quiet, filled with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. The child had begun to explore, shyly stepping around the room, touching objects with careful curiosity. Each movement was small but deliberate, as if they were learning what was safe in this new, unfamiliar world. John watched them quietly, never rushing, letting the child set the pace. He could see that the little one had been through a great deal already. Their eyes held a depth beyond their age, a mixture of fear, confusion, and an almost unspoken hope. John knew that trust could not be demanded. It had to grow slowly, like the careful planting of seeds in a dry field. He knelt beside the child and offered a gentle smile. "See this?" John said softly, picking up a small wooden cup from the table. "This is for water. And that one over there? He gestured toward a worn blanket draped over a chair. "Is for warmth. You can use it whenever you're cold." The child nodded, their small fingers brushing the edge of the cup, then the blanket. They did not speak, but their eyes lingered on John, a silent question forming in the depths of their gaze. John understood. It was the same question he had often asked himself when life seemed uncertain. Can I trust this stranger? Morning turned slowly into afternoon. John prepared a simple meal of bread, dried meat, and fresh water. He set it on the table, and the child hesitated only briefly before reaching out to eat. As they chewed quietly, John kept talking, sharing stories of the ranch, the animals, and the land. "There's a creek that winds past the hills," he said. "It's full of fish in the spring. Sometimes the deer come down to drink. You'll see them if you're quiet enough." The child's eyes brightened slightly at the mention of animals, a faint smile breaking across their face. For the first time since John had found them, he saw a spark of curiosity and comfort. It was a small victory, but an important one. After eating, the child wandered toward the window, watching the cattle graze in the fields, their fingers pressed against the glass, tracing shapes in the condensation. John joined them, leaning against the frame, his own gaze following the child's. "You like the land?" he asked. "It can be a harsh place, but it has its beauty too. You just have to know where to look." "It's big," John chuckled softly. "Yes, it is. Bigger than anything you've probably seen before." A silence settled between them, comfortable and quiet. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of the earth, of grass, and something else John could not quite place. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it made the hair on his arms stand on end. He shook the feeling away, focusing instead on the child, who was slowly beginning to feel safer in the presence of another human being. As the afternoon wore on, John suggested a small walk around the ranch. The child hesitated at first, fear flickering across their face, but John offered his hand. "I'll be right here," he said. "Nothing's going to happen to you while I'm around." The child reached out, gripping his hand tightly, and together they stepped outside. The sunlight was warm on their faces, and the wind carried the gentle rustle of grass and the distant cries of birds. The child's steps were tentative at first, but they soon began to move with more confidence, exploring the edges of the cabin, the creek, and the small grove of trees nearby. John pointed out various plants and animals, explaining which berries were safe to eat and which animals they might see in the distance. The child listened intently, absorbing every word, their eyes wide with wonder. For a brief moment, the harshness of the world seemed to fade, replaced by curiosity and the simple joy of discovery. But as the day progressed, John could not shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them. He noticed shadows moving strangely between the trees, and the wind seemed to carry faint whispers that disappeared whenever he turned to listen. The child remained oblivious to these signs too, caught up in the small miracles of the day. By late afternoon, they returned to the cabin. John decided it was time to clean up and prepare for the evening. He helped the child wash their hands and face in a basin of warm water, the child shivering slightly, but relaxing under John's gentle guidance. "Feeling better?" he asked. The child nodded, a faint smile tugging at their lips. It was a small, fragile thing, but John felt a warmth spread through his chest. He had seen fear and loss in many forms over the years, but this was different. This child had been abandoned, left alone in the wilderness, and yet here they were, slowly learning to trust. As evening approached, the sky turned shades of deep orange and purple. The wind had died down, leaving the ranch bathed in a calm golden light. John built a fire in the small stone hearth, the flames crackling softly, casting long shadows on the wooden walls. The child sat close, their small body wrapped in the blanket, watching the dancing flames. John told stories of the land, of animals, and of the people who had once lived here. He spoke of kindness, courage, and the importance of protecting those who could not protect themselves. The child listened, eyes wide, occasionally leaning against him for comfort. Night fell, bringing with it a deeper quiet. The ranch, usually alive with the sounds of nocturnal animals, seemed almost too still. The child had drifted off to sleep by the fire, their small chest rising and falling gently. John sat nearby, keeping watch, his mind restless with questions. Who had left this child in the wilderness? Why had they been abandoned? And what dangers might be waiting just beyond the hills? John knew the answers would not come easily, but he also knew that the child's safety depended on him. He would not let anything happen to this small, fragile life. As the hours passed, John reflected on his own life. He had spent decades on this land, facing storms, wild animals, and the unpredictability of the plains. Yet nothing had prepared him for the responsibility of sheltering a child who had already known so much fear. He felt a mixture of determination, worry, and a strange hope that perhaps this child could bring a new chapter to his life as well. Suddenly a sound made him tense. It was faint at first, like the shifting of branches, but then he heard it again, a soft, almost imperceptible movement near the edge of the clearing. He rose slowly, keeping his eyes on the shadows. The child stirred slightly in sleep, murmuring but did not wake. John strained his ears, listening, heart pounding. Minutes passed, and the sound did not come again. Perhaps it was just the wind, or an animal moving quietly through the trees. Still, a sense of unease lingered. The plains were vast and wild, and John had learned long ago that the land often held secrets, some of which were better left unexplored. He returned to the fire, keeping the child close. The warmth of the flames was comforting, but it did little to chase away the lingering tension. John knew that the night was only the beginning. Whatever had abandoned this child, whatever had left them alone in the wilderness, would not be far behind. And yet, despite the fear and uncertainty, there was also a quiet bond forming between them. The child had begun to trust him, even in small ways, and John had come to care deeply for the fragile little life he had found. Together, in the quiet of the cabin, they faced the unknown, connected by a shared need for safety and comfort. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, John spoke softly to the child. "You're safe here tonight. No one can hurt you while I'm around." The child murmured something in response too quiet for him to hear, but their small hand reached out and touched his arm. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried more weight than words ever could. The night stretched on, full of quiet moments and soft shadows. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint promise of challenges yet to come. But inside the cabin there was warmth, there was safety, and there was a fragile sense of hope. John knew that the morning would bring new questions and perhaps new dangers. But for now, he simply watched over the child, ready to face whatever came next, determined to protect this small, abandoned life at all costs. And somewhere deep in the quiet darkness, the plains themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the events that the dawn would reveal. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, spilling soft gold and pink across the rolling hills. The ranch was quiet, bathed in the calm of early morning. The creek gurgled gently, reflecting the sky like a narrow, shimmering ribbon. Birds began their morning songs, breaking the stillness, but the air felt unusually heavy, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Inside the cabin, the child was already awake. Their small eyes scanned the room cautiously, searching for familiar shapes in the dim light. John stirred on the other side of the fire, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. The warmth from the embers had kept the child comfortable through the night, and for the first time, there had been no sounds of crying or fear. John stretched and glanced at the child. "Good morning," he said softly. "Did you sleep well?" The child's lips quivered slightly, and they nodded, but their eyes darted toward the window. Something had caught their attention, something beyond the cabin, beyond the familiar trees and creek. John followed their gaze and froze. A figure was moving through the mist near the edge of the clearing. At first it was just a dark shape, tall and looming, but as the morning light grew stronger, its size became clear. The figure was enormous, taller than any human John had ever seen, and draped in a long black cloak that moved like liquid shadow across the dew-covered grass. The wind seemed to bend around it, carrying a sense of sorrow and power. The child's eyes widened in fear, and they clutched John's arm. Who is that?" they whispered. John did not answer immediately. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure seemed almost otherworldly, impossibly tall, with long flowing hair that caught the first rays of sunlight. Its presence was quiet but commanding, filling the clearing without a sound. John had faced storms, wild animals, and lonely nights on the plains, but he had never seen anything like this. Slowly the figure moved closer. The grass bowed under each step, and the morning mist swirled around its feet. John stepped in front of the child, his instincts screaming at him to protect the small life beside him. He kept his voice calm, though his heart pounded. "Stay behind me," he said softly. "Everything's going to be okay." The figure stopped a few yards away from the cabin, and for a long moment there was only silence. Then it raised its head. Its eyes were enormous and dark, filled with grief and warning. The child gasped, recognizing something familiar in the sorrowful gaze. They reached out instinctively, but John gently held them back. The figure spoke, but not with words. Its voice was carried on the wind, a sound like soft bells and distant echoes. Yet the meaning was clear. The child was not alone. This figure had been searching for them, had been looking over them even when they were abandoned. John realized that the child's story was far more complicated than he had imagined. Whoever had left the child in the wilderness had not been the first person to watch over them. This giant widow, as she now seemed, was connected to the child in a way John could not yet understand. The child's lips trembled as they whispered, barely audible. She is my—" He could see the recognition in the child's eyes, the flicker of relief mixed with awe. The widow, towering in silence, seemed to wait for the child to approach, but the child remained hesitant, unsure of whether to step forward. The air around them grew colder, and the cabin's wooden walls creaked as if responding to the presence outside. The widow moved slightly, her cloak flowing like shadows caught in sunlight, and the wind carried a faint scent of flowers, smoke, and something ancient. John's skin prickled. This was no ordinary visitor. Finally, the child took a hesitant step forward, still holding John's hand. I'm here," they said softly. The widow inclined her head, a gesture of recognition and sorrow. Her eyes softened, but there was still a weight to her presence, a reminder that the world beyond the ranch was harsh and unforgiving. John felt a mixture of awe and fear. He had never believed in stories of spirits or giants, yet here one stood, alive and moving before him. The widow extended a hand toward the child. It was enormous, yet careful, gentle, like the hand of someone who had known loss and pain. The child reached out tentatively, and their small fingers brushed against her massive ones. The contact sent a shiver through John, not of fear, but of recognition. The connection between them was undeniable. Through gestures and subtle motions, the widow conveyed a story without words. The child had been abandoned to protect them, to keep them safe from dangers John could only guess at. The child was part of a larger story, a lineage, a family that had been scattered and lost. And the widow had been searching for them all this time, traveling through lands, crossing plains and mountains, guided by the hope of finding the child alive. John felt a deep respect for the figure before him. Despite her enormous size, there was nothing threatening in her demeanor. She carried a weight of sorrow, yes, but also a tenderness that spoke of love beyond measure. The child, sensing the connection, clung to her hand, comforted in a way they had not been since before they were left alone in the wilderness. The widow's gaze turned toward John, and though she did not speak, her eyes seemed to ask a silent question. "Who is this man? Can I trust him with the child?" John nodded slowly, understanding her concern. "I found them," he said simply. "I've kept them safe. I won't let anything happen to them." The widow's eyes softened, and she gave a subtle nod. There was an unspoken agreement forming between them. John realized that he was now part of a story much larger than his ranch, larger than the plains he had called home for decades. He was entrusted with protecting this child, not just from the elements, but from a world filled with dangers he had only begun to understand. The child looked up at John and then back at the widow. Their small face was a mixture of awe, relief, and newfound trust. I'm safe?" they asked. John smiled gently. Yes, you're safe now. The widow extended her hand again, beckoning the child closer. The child hesitated for a heartbeat, then stepped forward, taking her hand fully this time. The connection between them seemed to glow in the morning light, a bond that neither time nor distance could break. John watched silently, his heart swelling with a mix of wonder and responsibility. He realized that the child's life had been shaped by forces beyond his understanding, and yet he also understood that he had a role to play. His ranch, his home, his experience, these were now part of the child's journey, part of the safety net that would allow them to grow and survive. The widow's presence was quiet but commanding, a reminder of the past and a promise for the future. She did not linger unnecessarily, yet she stayed long enough to ensure that the child knew they were protected, that their journey was only beginning, and that the world, though dangerous, had guardians watching over them. As the widow finally began to retreat, her enormous figure slowly disappearing into the mist beyond the clearing, John felt a strange calm settle over him. The child clung to the blanket once more, but now their eyes were wide with understanding. They had seen a glimpse of something extraordinary, something that reminded them that even in the harshest circumstances, hope and protection could be found. The morning continued, filled with a quiet energy. Birds sang more boldly, the creek sparkled in the sunlight, and the ranch seemed alive with new possibilities. John and the child returned to the cabin, walking slowly, both lost in thought. Neither spoke much, but their shared experience had created a bond that words could not capture. John began preparing breakfast while the child sat by the fire, glancing occasionally toward the window where the widow had disappeared. The memory of her towering figure, the sadness and love in her eyes lingered. John knew that the day ahead would bring questions, perhaps dangers, but for now, there was safety, warmth, and a fragile sense of hope. The events of the morning had changed everything. The child was no longer just an abandoned soul. They were part of a larger story, a story tied to family, legacy, and protection. And John, the quiet rancher who had spent a lifetime tending the land, had become a guardian in his own right, entrusted with the care of a life that was extraordinary in ways he could scarcely imagine. As the sun climbed higher, the ranch seemed to hold its breath once more, as if acknowledging the presence of something greater than itself. John knew the plains were full of secrets and challenges, but he also knew that together with the child they would face whatever came next. And somewhere beyond the hills and the mist, the giant widow had left a silent promise that no matter the dangers ahead, they would not face them alone. The morning sun was climbing steadily over the hills, spilling its warm light across the wide fields of the ranch. The child sat by the cabin window, gazing out at the misty trees, their small hands folded in their lap. Their mind was still filled with the memory of the enormous widow from the previous morning. Her presence had been both terrifying and comforting, a reminder that the child was part of something greater, something larger than the lonely plains they had wandered. John moved quietly around the cabin, preparing a small breakfast. He kept stealing glances at the child, who seemed lost in thought. There was a seriousness in their eyes that belied their age. They had survived alone in the wilderness, had faced fear and hunger, and yet there was also curiosity and a spark of hope that had begun to grow since John had found them. The widow did not return immediately, but the feeling of her presence lingered. John knew she would come back. Her gaze had promised protection, and the child had sensed it too. He sat down beside the child, who looked up at him with a small, questioning expression. "She's coming back, isn't she?" the child whispered.
John nodded. I think she will.
"She wants to make sure you're safe." A few hours passed in quiet anticipation. The child played with a small wooden toy John had found in the cabin, though their mind seemed elsewhere. John prepared food and tidied the space, but his attention kept drifting to the window. Then, as the sun reached its highest point, a shadow appeared at the edge of the clearing. The widow had returned. Her enormous figure moved with surprising grace across the open field, her black cloak flowing like liquid shadow. Her eyes, full of sorrow and wisdom, met John's briefly, and then she turned her gaze toward the child. The child froze for a moment, caught between fear and recognition, and then stepped forward cautiously. The widow knelt down, bringing herself closer to the child's level, though even then she towered over them. Her voice was soft, almost like the rustle of leaves carrying words that were gentle and kind. Even if John could not understand them fully, the child responded in the same way, speaking softly, their words carrying meaning that transcended the need for clarity. John watched in awe as the widow began to share a story, not in words that he fully understood, but in gestures, expressions, and the emotions that radiated from her. The child listened intently, leaning closer, their small hand reaching for hers. The story was one of family, loss, and the harshness of the world beyond the hills. The widow had lost someone dear to her, someone she had searched for tirelessly, and now she had found a part of that family once again. Through her movements and expressions, John realized that the child was her niece or nephew, left in the wilderness to protect them from dangers that the child could not yet comprehend. There had been conflict, loss, and separation, and the child had been hidden, abandoned, or perhaps left with the hope that they would survive and be found. The widow's eyes glistened with tears as she conveyed the depth of her sorrow and the relief of reunion. The child reached out, touching her hand, and for the first time since their abandonment, they felt a sense of belonging. The widow's enormous hand enveloped theirs gently, a promise of protection and love. John, though still outside this private exchange, felt the weight of the moment. He realized that he was witnessing not just a reunion, but the bridging of generations, the restoration of a connection that had been nearly lost forever. As the morning wore on, the widow began to guide the child outside the cabin. John followed at a careful distance, sensing that this was an important part of the process. The widow led the child to the edge of the clearing, pointing to the hills beyond and gesturing at the land around them. Through her gestures, it became clear that she was teaching the child about their heritage, about the land, and about the strength they had inherited from their family. John observed as the child's eyes brightened with understanding. They began to mimic her gestures, learning not just the movements but the meaning behind them. This was more than a lesson. It was a transfer of history, a passing of knowledge and responsibility. John could see that the child was beginning to feel powerful in a new way, no longer just a frightened, abandoned child, but someone with roots, purpose, and the support of a caring guardian. But even as the lesson continued, John could sense the tension in the air. The plains were vast, and while the immediate clearing felt safe, the world beyond was unpredictable. The widow's eyes kept flicking toward the horizon, scanning the hills and the trees as if expecting someone or something to appear. John's own instincts screamed that danger might be near, though he could not see it yet. The child noticed the tension and turned to John, their small hand finding his. "Will they come back?" they asked, referring to whoever had abandoned them. John squeezed their hand reassuringly. "If they do, we'll face them together. You're not alone anymore." The widow, sensing the exchange, nodded approvingly, her massive form casting a long shadow over the grass. She guided the child back toward the cabin, but John could see that her presence was like a shield, protective and unwavering. There was an unspoken understanding that she would remain near until the child was safe and secure, and that she would intervene if any threat approached. Once inside the cabin, the widow used subtle gestures to indicate the child's belongings, items that had been left behind or hidden for their protection. The child picked up a small bundle of cloth and personal items, holding them close with reverence. John noticed the care with which the widow instructed the child, teaching them to value and preserve these objects, not just for their material worth but for the stories they carried. The child's eyes sparkled with curiosity and understanding. John realized that in the hours since they had met the widow, the child had begun to grow in confidence. Their fear was slowly being replaced with knowledge, understanding, and the beginnings of hope. The widow's attention then turned toward John. She did not speak, but her eyes conveyed a clear message. She recognized his kindness, his courage, and his protective instincts. In the silent language of trust, she seemed to be asking for his continued support, for his willingness to help nurture and safeguard this small life. John met her gaze steadily, understanding that he had become part of a larger story, one that required vigilance, compassion, and courage.
The afternoon stretched on, filled with quiet moments of connection, teaching, and observation.
The child moved between the widow and John, absorbing lessons, receiving comfort, and beginning to feel the security of family and guardianship. The ranch, once a place of routine and solitude, now buzzed quietly with purpose and care. But even as calm and warmth filled the cabin, John could not ignore the sense of unease that lingered outside. The plains were wide and open, and someone, or something, might be watching from the hills or the trees. The widow's presence reassured him, but he also knew that protection required vigilance. He kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning for signs of movement, while the child continued to absorb lessons from both guardians. As evening approached, the widow began to prepare to leave, but she did so slowly, ensuring that the child understood their connection and knew that they would not be abandoned again. She gestured toward the hills, toward the path that led beyond the clearing, and the child nodded, understanding that this was not a final departure, but a temporary absence. John observed quietly, feeling a mix of awe and responsibility. The child was learning about their past, their lineage, and the strength that came from knowing they were not alone. The widow had imparted more than knowledge. She had given reassurance, safety, and a sense of belonging that the child had not felt in a long time. Before disappearing into the mist beyond the hills, the widow placed her massive hand gently on the child's shoulder. The gesture was both a blessing and a warning.
Be strong, be careful, and remember who you are.
The child's small fingers lingered on her hand for a moment before letting go, a silent promise to honor her trust and protection. John knelt beside the child, holding them close.
See?
He said softly.
You're not alone anymore.
You have people who care for you, and people who will protect you. The child leaned into him, their eyes shining with emotion. I understand, they whispered. The evening settled over the ranch, casting long shadows and bathing the land in golden light. John and the child moved inside the cabin, preparing for the night. Outside, the wind rustled gently through the trees, carrying whispers of stories, warnings, and promises yet to be fulfilled. Even as calm returned, John knew that the world beyond the clearing remained unpredictable. Danger could come from the hills, the forests, or the distant plains. But he also knew that with the child's courage, the widow's guidance, and his own experience, they would face whatever challenges arose. The child, for the first time in a long while, felt safe. They had discovered a sense of belonging, a connection to family, and the beginnings of knowledge and strength that would help them survive. John, too, felt the sense of purpose and commitment. He had become part of this larger story, and he would not let fear or uncertainty prevent him from protecting this small life entrusted to him. As night approached, John and the child sat by the fire, the warmth comforting and steady. The memory of the widow lingered in the room, a reminder of love, loss, and hope. The child held their small bundle of belongings close, feeling the weight of their past and the promise of the future. And in the quiet of the evening, the ranch itself seemed to acknowledge the presence of guardians, family, and courage. John knew that the day had changed everything. The child's life was no longer defined by abandonment or fear. It was shaped by connection, guidance, and the promise of protection. And though challenges remained, they would face them together with courage, wisdom, and trust in those who watched over them. The morning broke slowly, casting soft golden light across the ranch. The air was calm, but a subtle tension lingered, as if the plains themselves were aware of the events yet to unfold. John stood outside the cabin, surveying the fields. The child was nearby, helping to carry a small bundle of food from the cabin to the porch, their movements careful and deliberate. Despite their young age, the child had grown stronger in the days since John had found them, their eyes brighter and their expression more confident. The widow had departed after the previous evening, leaving behind a lingering sense of protection and a silent promise that she would always watch from afar. Though she was gone, her presence remained in the child's mind, in the warmth of their connection and in the strength they now carried. John knew that the child's life had already begun to change in ways neither of them fully understood. As they worked together, John noticed movement along the tree line at the edge of the clearing. At first it was subtle, a rustling of leaves, the occasional shadow. But soon it became clear that they were not alone. Someone, or something, was approaching the cabin. John's instincts sharpened. He could feel the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. "Stay close to me," he said quietly, placing a protective hand on the child's small shoulder. The child nodded, sensing both the danger and John's determination. A figure emerged from the trees. It was a man, tall and cautious, with tired eyes and a hardened expression. His clothes were rough, worn from travel, and he carried a small pack slung across his back. John tensed, unsure of his intentions. The man raised his hands slightly in greeting, showing he meant no harm, but his eyes flicked nervously toward the child. "I'm looking for a child," the man said, his voice steady but filled with urgency.
I was told they might be here.
John's mind raced. Could this man be connected to whoever had abandoned the child? Or was he someone searching with good intentions, sent by family or community? He studied the man carefully, weighing the risk.
Who sent you?
John asked, his tone calm but firm. The man hesitated, then replied,
I was sent by their family. There's danger approaching. People who mean harm, not just to the child, but to anyone protecting them. I was told to find the child and keep them safe.
John glanced at the child, who watched the exchange with wide eyes. The child's small hands clutched their blanket, their mind likely filled with a mix of fear and curiosity. John realized that the world beyond the ranch was far more complex and dangerous than he had imagined. Yet he also understood that this man could be an ally, someone who had come to help rather than harm.
Then we'll work together, John said. The child is safe here. But we need to move carefully. Danger could be closer than you think.
The man nodded, respect and relief in his eyes. Together, the three adults, John, the man, and the memory of the widow's presence, formed an unspoken plan. John would stay near the child, keeping them safe within the ranch, while the man would scout the surrounding area for any threats. The child, though small, sensed the gravity of the moment and stayed close to John, their hand firmly in his. Hours passed as the morning sun climbed higher. The ranch felt both peaceful and tense, a place of calm surrounded by unseen threats. Birds sang from the trees and the creek gurgled quietly, yet every shadow seemed to carry the possibility of danger.
John and the man moved carefully, checking fences, securing supplies, and ensuring that the child remained safe.
The widow's teachings lingered in the child's mind. They had learned to observe, to recognize patterns in the wind and the movement of animals, and to trust their instincts. Now, they began to apply these lessons, their eyes sharp and alert, noticing even small details that could signal danger. By midday, the threat had become clear. A group of strangers was approaching the ranch, moving cautiously through the trees. John's instincts told him that they meant harm, and he acted quickly. He gathered the child and led them to a hidden part of the cabin, a small storage area that could serve as a temporary shelter. The child clutched the blanket, their eyes wide but steady, ready to follow John's lead. The man moved silently outside, using the cover of trees and tall grass to observe the approaching strangers. He returned quickly, whispering to John, "There's at least 3 of them."
They haven't seen us yet, but they're close. We need to act fast.
John nodded. He looked at the child, speaking softly so as not to alarm them.
We're going to stay safe, okay? Just like we practiced. We'll be fine.
The child nodded, trusting John completely now. Together, John and the man prepared to confront the intruders. They moved carefully, using the land to their advantage.
Rocks, trees, and uneven ground became tools for defense and strategy. The child stayed hidden, watching and learning, aware that courage sometimes meant staying quiet and alert.
The strangers drew closer, their voices low and harsh as they searched for signs of life. John's heart pounded, but he remained calm, relying on his years of experience on the plains. He guided the child to remain still, whispering words of reassurance. Then, just as the strangers approached the clearing, the widow appeared. Her enormous figure emerged from the mist, towering and imposing. The strangers froze, sensing the presence of something extraordinary and powerful. The widow's eyes, filled with sorrow and warning, fixed on them, and her voice, though soft, carried an undeniable authority. The strangers hesitated, fear evident in their movements. They had not expected resistance, especially not from a figure of such immense presence. John seized the moment, guiding the child to a safer spot while the widow confronted the intruders silently. Her cloak flowed around her like shadows, and the wind seemed to bend to her will. It was clear that she was more than human, a guardian of the child with strength and authority beyond ordinary measure. The strangers realized quickly that they were outmatched. Without a word, they retreated, disappearing into the trees and leaving the clearing quiet once more. John exhaled, relief washing over him, and the child clung to his arm, both amazed and comforted by what they had witnessed. The widow knelt again, bringing herself close to the child's level. She gestured softly, conveying reassurance and safety. The child reached out, holding her hand once more, feeling the warmth and protection that had guided them through fear and uncertainty. John watched silently, understanding that the bond between them had been strengthened through shared experience, courage, and trust. With the threat gone, the widow turned her gaze to John. Though she did not speak, her eyes expressed gratitude and respect. John nodded, acknowledging the unspoken agreement. They were allies now, connected by the protection of the child and the shared responsibility of keeping them safe. The rest of the afternoon passed in quiet calm. John and the child worked together to restore the cabin, checking supplies and reinforcing safety. The child carried a sense of confidence and awareness that had not existed before. They moved with purpose, remembering the widow's lessons and John's guidance, learning that courage and care often went hand in hand. As evening approached, the widow prepared to leave again, her massive form retreating slowly into the mist beyond the hills. She stopped briefly, placing her enormous hand gently on the child's shoulder, a final gesture of blessing and protection. The child held onto her hand for a moment longer, then let go, feeling the strength and love she had imparted. John knelt beside the child, holding them close.
"See?" he said softly. "You're safe now! You have people who care for you, and you have the strength to face anything that comes next."
I know," they whispered. Night fell over the ranch, casting long shadows across the fields and trees. The wind carried the faint whispers of the plains, but inside the cabin there was warmth, safety, and peace. John and the child sat by the fire, sharing a quiet meal, their hearts full of relief and hope. In the days that followed, the child continued to grow in confidence and strength. They explored the ranch with John, learned to care for the animals, and applied the lessons taught by the widow. The memory of her enormous protective presence remained, a guiding force in their life. John watched with quiet pride as the child developed resilience and courage. They were no longer a frightened, abandoned soul. They were a survivor, a learner, and a child with a sense of belonging. The bond between John and the child deepened, built on trust, protection, and shared experience. The ranch, once a place of quiet routine, had become a sanctuary, a place where fear was replaced by hope, where courage was nurtured, and where love, simple, protective, and steadfast, held the center.
John knew that challenges might come again, but he also knew that with the child's strength, the widow's guidance, and his own experience, they could face anything together. And so, under the soft glow of the moon and the gentle rustle of the plains, life at the ranch continued. The child had found safety, connection, and a sense of belonging. John had found a renewed purpose, one that reminded him of the power of kindness, courage, and protection.
And somewhere beyond the hills, the widow's silent presence remained, watching over them, a promise that no matter what the future held, they would not face it alone.